Summary of my feral romance. Daphne had always been different. From the moment she was born, she had known that her life would never follow the same path as those around her. Her mother, a fierce and untamed fae from the unseelie court, had given birth to her in a violent storm of magic. It had been the kind of birth that shook the very foundations of the forest, and her father had paid the price for their volatile union. He had lost his ear to her mother's fury, a reminder of their tumultuous relationship that would haunt Daphne throughout her life. This primal beginning had set the stage for a life full of rebellion, struggle, and a deep sense of isolation. Growing up in the unseelie court had not been easy. Daphne's family was known for their chaotic nature, and she quickly learned that she was an outcast even within her own community. While the other fae were comfortable in their inherent power and beauty, Daphne felt like an outsider. She was too much like her mother, too wild, too untamed, too prone to fits of anger and frustration. There was a restlessness within her that could not be quelled, and it often led to violent outbursts. But she was also an artist, and art became her refuge. Drawing was the one thing that could silence the storm inside her, a way for her to express her emotions and create beauty amidst the chaos. Daphne's skills as an artist were undeniable. She had an innate talent for capturing the human form, particularly the female body, which she often depicted in her artwork. There was something about the fluidity and grace of women that spoke to her, something she felt she could understand on a deep level. The curves, the expressions, the raw emotions, they were all familiar to her, and she poured her heart and soul into every piece. Yet, when it came to drawing men, something always went wrong. Their bodies were awkward, their expressions flat, their poses stiff. It was a mystery to Daphne why she could not draw a male figure with the same ease and fluidity that she could with women. Her first attempt to integrate into human society had been a disaster. She had spent years living in the unseelie forest, honing her skills in isolation, but when she was finally forced to enter the human world, she was unprepared for the intricacies of high society. Her debutante season was a disaster, marked by awkward social interactions and a complete inability to fit in. It was the first time she had ever tried to live as a human, and she quickly learned that she was out of place. One particular event stood out in her memory: the night she had bitten off a young man's ear in a fit of rage after he made an inappropriate comment. That moment had been a wake-up call, and Daphne had fled back to the unseelie court, swearing never to return to human society again. But time had passed, and Daphne found herself giving humanity another chance. She had spent the last decade living a quieter life, working a modest job in the working class of Jasper, a human city. She had managed to fit in, blending into the crowd with her human form and her stable job as an illustrator at a publishing house. She had a steady income, a small group of friends, and a relatively peaceful existence. But deep down, Daphne still felt like an outsider. Despite her outward success, the gnawing feeling that she did not belong was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Her job at the publishing house was a dream come true in many ways. She had always wanted to be an illustrator, and the opportunity to work on book covers was the perfect way for her to pursue her passion. But it also came with its own set of pressures. She was still relatively new to the job, and the expectations placed on her were high. Daphne often found herself doubting her abilities, convinced that she would never be able to measure up to the other, more experienced artists. This sense of inadequacy only grew worse as she continued to work on her latest project, a set of illustrations for a historical romance novel. It was a Friday morning when Daphne found herself sitting in the illustration studio, staring at her latest sketch. She had been working on the cover for days, but it just wasn't coming together. The male figure, meant to be the strong and handsome hero of the story, looked more like a lumpy stick figure than anything remotely resembling a handsome man. His arms were too long, his torso too short, and his face, well, his face was all wrong. Daphne had spent hours tweaking the proportions, but nothing seemed to work. The more she tried to fix it, the worse it got. Her frustration mounted as she stared at the sketch, her hand trembling slightly as she tried to erase yet another mistake. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and Daphne couldn't help but feel the creeping sense of dread that this might be the moment she finally failed. Her colleagues were already whispering behind her back, she was sure of it. They were all far more skilled than she was, and there she was, stuck in this endless cycle of self-doubt and inadequacy. If she couldn't fix this one illustration, what would become of her career? She had no formal training, no prestigious art school behind her, only her innate talent, which seemed to be failing her at the most crucial moment. Just then, a fluttering sound broke her concentration. She glanced up to see Araminta, a mischievous book sprite, hovering beside her desk. Araminta was made entirely of paper, her tiny wings flapping rapidly as she circled Daphne's workspace. The sprite had been assigned to the studio as a kind of impish assistant, and though she was supposed to help with the creative process, her primary role seemed to be tormenting Daphne at every turn. "Still struggling, are we?" Araminta chirped, her voice as sharp as the sound of paper rustling. "I must say, it's quite impressive how bad you are at drawing men." Daphne clenched her jaw and resisted the urge to snap at the sprite. Araminta had a knack for finding her weaknesses and poking at them, and Daphne had learned over the years that fighting back only made things worse. Instead, she took a deep breath and tried to focus on the task at hand. "I just can't get the proportions right," Daphne muttered, her voice tinged with frustration. "Every time I try, it looks wrong. I don't understand why I can draw women so easily, but men, they're a mess." Araminta hovered closer, her paper-thin face alight with mischief. "Oh, darling, you simply aren't cut out for it. Maybe you should stick to what you know. Women are your forte, after all." Daphne bit her lip, resisting the urge to slap the sprite out of the air. She knew Araminta was only trying to get a rise out of her, but there was a kernel of truth in the sprite's teasing. Daphne had always been better at drawing women. The curves, the expressions, the way their bodies could convey emotion, it all came naturally to her. But men? She could never seem to get them right. The sharp angles of their features, the musculature of their bodies, nothing about it made sense to her. And now, she was expected to create a series of illustrations that required male protagonists. If she couldn't draw a convincing male figure, what would become of her career? "Maybe you should get some help," Araminta suggested, flitting around Daphne's head. "Find yourself a model. That way, you can stop flailing about and actually see what a real man looks like." Daphne froze at the suggestion. A model? The idea filled her with unease. She wasn't used to working with live subjects. Drawing from life was a skill she had never developed, and the thought of asking a man to pose for her was daunting. But as much as she hated to admit it, Araminta had a point. If she was ever going to improve, she needed to face her fear and learn what she was missing. "I'll find someone," Daphne said quietly, the weight of her decision settling in. "I have no other choice." Araminta's wings fluttered excitedly. "I'll help. I know a few men around here who could pose for you. Trust me, you'll get the hang of it in no time." Daphne nodded, feeling a strange sense of determination rising within her. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this was no different. She would find a model, face her fear, and finally learn how to draw men. It was the only way she would ever be able to make a name for herself as an illustrator. As the days passed, Daphne's nerves grew. She had never been good at interacting with strangers, especially men. The thought of asking someone to pose for her felt like a monumental task. But she reminded herself that this was her only chance to prove herself. If she wanted to succeed in the world of illustration, she had to overcome her insecurities and face the reality that she wasn't perfect, and that was okay. Finally, after much deliberation, Daphne made up her mind. She would ask a man to pose for her. She might be nervous, but she couldn't let her fear hold her back any longer. She had come too far to fail now.